There's a familiar figure at every gun rights rally, in every firearms forum, and behind the counter of many local gun shops. The Fudd. Well, he's not a stranger to our world. He owns guns. He may have grown up hunting or shooting competitively. He knows how to clean a rifle, load a magazine, and safely handle a handgun. And yet, when the conversation turns to the law, he'll eagerly endorse restrictions that undermine the very right that keeps his gun legal in the first place. The Fudd's not an enemy by intention. He's a casualty of anti-gun propaganda and a useful tool for those who want to see the Second Amendment strangled by regulation.
Dan Was, author of Good Gun, Bad Guy.
Second Amendment advocate and author extraordinaire, Dan Was.
Good Gun, Bad Guy. Dan Was joins me now.
Dan Was is my guest, and he's here.
The defining feature of a Fudd is cognitive dissonance. On one side sits a lived reality. He knows guns, trusts guns, and depends on guns for sport, self-defense, or simply because they're part of his life. On the other side sits a manufactured belief system absorbed over years from the political left, its allies in the media, and the endless drumbeat of so-called common sense gun safety. The result is a split identity. One belief says, I'm a responsible gun owner, guns are not the problem, I should be allowed to keep what I have. The other side says, but we need more laws, more restrictions, more control, because obviously something must be done. These two beliefs can't coexist without contradiction. The Second Amendment does not protect a privilege granted by the state. It protects a pre-existing right given to us by God. Every new law that narrows who can buy, how they can buy, what they can buy, where they can carry, or how they can store their firearms chips away at that right. The Fudd, however, has been trained to see those laws as reasonable, even while he continues to watch his own ability to exercise the Second Amendment erode. He'll insist he is pro-Second Amendment while supporting measures that would have been considered blatant infringements by the founders and by any honest interpretation of the Second Amendment. Anti-gun lobbyists, politicians, and much of the mainstream media know they face a credibility problem. If they were honest, they would say, we want fewer owners, fewer guns, and ultimately a society where private ownership is a narrow exception. If they were really being honest, they would tell you they want a complete ban on anything that goes bang. But that would be unacceptable to most Americans. So instead, they wrap their proposals in the language of compromise and common sense. And who better to sell that message to the public than a gun owner? When a lobbyist stands at a podium and says, even gun owners support these common sense laws, they're almost always pointing to Fudds. When a news segment features a responsible firearm owner calling for magazine limits, red flag laws, or universal background checks, they're not showcasing independent thought. They're showcasing a useful tool in their mission to disarm America. The Fudd provides legitimacy. He lets the anti-gun crowd say, this isn't about banning all guns. Real gun owners agree with us. Only extremists oppose these modest reforms. In reality, those modest reforms become the baseline for the next demand. The Fudd, convinced he's being reasonable and enjoying all the attention, helps turn the screws on his own rights and on the right of every other gun owner. For the gun control movement, the Fudd is not a partner, he's a necessary tool. The phrase common sense gun laws is a political slogan, not a legal or constitutional standard. It's designed to make opposition sound irrational. Who could be against common sense? The implication is that if you don't support the latest gun law, you have no common sense. But when you press on what those laws actually do, the picture changes. They impose waiting periods on a right that's supposed to be immediate. They create licensing regimes that turn a constitutional right into a government-issued privilege. They ban categories of firearms or features based on cosmetic or political criteria, not on any coherent principle of self-defense or real ballistic measurement. They expand disqualifications in ways that have little to do with safety and much to do with bureaucratic convenience and a catering to the fearful anti-gun crowd. From a constitutional perspective, the Second Amendment's not a suggestion box for legislators. It's a limitation on their power. The Supreme Court has made clear that the amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. It should not be subject to dishonest politicians looking for cheap votes. Yet the Fudd, steeped in the language of the left, accepts the premise that the right to keep and bear is negotiable and that it can be trimmed here and there as long as the core remains. Problem is that core keeps shrinking. What was once only registration becomes only licensing, becomes only certain guns, becomes only certain people. And the Fudd nods along at each step, assured that he's still inside the circle, until the circle's drawn so tightly that he too finds himself outside. There's a harsh term from political history: useful idiot. It describes someone who, often with good intentions, advances an agenda that ultimately harms their own interests and the principles they claim to support. The Fudd fits this role perfectly in the gun debate. He wants to be seen as reasonable. He wants to be welcomed by the anti-gun crowd as one of the good ones. He wants to distance himself from the so-called extremists who insist on the plain text of the Constitution, so he compromises his values by endorsing restrictions that make it harder for law-abiding people to exercise their rights, empower bureaucrats and police to decide who's fit to own a gun, and normalize the idea that the Second Amendment is a policy preference and not a fundamental right. In return, he gets praise from the very people whose long-term goal is a society where his guns are tolerated only as long as it's politically convenient. When the next crisis arrives, the Fudd will be shocked to find that the laws he supported are now being used to justify even more restrictions, and that he has contributed to it. History is littered with rights that were whittled away by so-called reasonable people who thought they could compromise with those who fundamentally opposed the right in question. The Second Amendment is no different. The path out of this contradiction is not complicated, but it's uncomfortable. It requires the Fudd to ask a few hard questions. If the Second Amendment protects a right, why should that right be subject to the same kinds of restrictions we would never accept for speech, religion, or due process? If common sense laws are so reasonable, why do they always move in one direction? More control, more prohibition, more discretion for the state. If gun owners are truly the problem, why do the vast majority of gun owners never commit crimes while the laws overwhelmingly burden the law-abiding? The anti-gun movement doesn't need to convince every gun owner. It only needs to convince enough of them to go along, to nod, to say, well, maybe that one law's okay. The Fudd is not necessarily evil, he's misled. But the consequences are real. A constitutional right gets slowly transformed into a regulated, government-issued privilege. The group of gun owners who, in their quest for acceptance, help dismantle the very right we struggle to defend. So for those of us who understand the Second Amendment as a hard limit on government power, the task is clear. We must stop treating gun control as a debate over policy and start treating it as a fight over principle. That means calling out the Fudd because they're not helping. It means to refuse the notion that our rights are somehow up for negotiation. And it means recognizing that every so-called common sense gun law is another infringement. The Second Amendment does not need friends who are eager to compromise. It needs defenders who understand that a right compromised is a right lost, and who are willing to say plainly and without apology that all gun laws are unconstitutional infringements on a fundamental liberty. I'm Dan Wass. Thanks for watching Good Gun, Bad Guy. And remember, the Second Amendment is not a privilege. It's your right.